So thank you for joining us from across Canada and around the world. Many of you may know me, but for those of you who don't, my name is Tina, and I'll be today's moderator. I would like to first point out that on your screen, you should see a round icon if you're using a computer, and that will allow you to join in French should you wish to have live simultaneous broadcast. That is a service that we're offering today for any Francophone speaking people who are on the call. You can have that interpretation. So with that, I do hope that you're looking forward to this dialogue. It's quite an interesting one. We're looking at maybe talking about the challenges and opportunities for Cuso International, but also for the volunteer cooperation sector as a whole. So before we begin, though, I would like to start off with a land acknowledgement from where I am in Toronto. Land acknowledgements are a common practice in civic and community spaces across Canada. We know that they are but a small step, but an important one towards reconciliation. For non-Indigenous Canadians, it's an opportunity to reflect on the impacts of colonialism and to be accountable to Indigenous people. Toronto is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and it is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and we are grateful to be able to live and work on this land. So at this time, and I haven't done this before, but if you know the territory that you're joining us from, as you know, the 5% of the world's population is considered Indigenous. So I welcome you to put the reflections in the chat around the territories that you are joining us from. And so again, I know many of you know Cuso International, but for those of you who are coming with us on this ride for the first time, Cuso International is a Canadian non-for-profit organization focused on ending poverty and inequality. We work on today's most important development issues by connecting global communities in need with the skills they need to create lasting change. We've been doing this for 60 years. How? Through education, empowerment, and an enabling environment. Our skilled volunteers and staff work with hundreds of local partners around the world to advance gender equality, enrich the lives of women and girls, and improve economic opportunities for vulnerable and marginalized communities. And as I said, today will be very interesting. It's an important town hall where we will discuss the impact of community-based volunteering and how diverse volunteer models impact communities. And with us today for this town hall, we have subject matter expert Bianca Fadel and Cuso International volunteers Friedman and Carmencita Menchie Alcantara. So please allow me to introduce them formally through their bios. Bianca Fadel is a research fellow in the Center for International Development at Northumbria University in the UK. Bianca's current research work analyzes identity and belonging in local volunteering during crises, particularly in the case of Burundi in East Africa. Her background is in international relations and humanitarian diplomacy, and she is currently also engaged in policy-focused research initiatives with volunteer-involving organizations. She has previously worked as an advisor for humanitarian diplomacy at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Brazil, and is particularly interested in the interfaces between humanitarian and development work, volunteer experiences, and participatory methodologies. And we'll hear more from Bianca, but I did want, you can unmute your mic and say a quick hello, Bianca.
Hi, everyone. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Next, we also have Menchie Alcantara joining us today. She was a volunteer as a multi-sector nutrition intervention advisor for the GROW project, and you're going to hear much more about that project later on. It was in East Harare in 2017 to 2019, and West Harare and the Afar region in 2019 and 2020, in the Oromia region in Ethiopia. And she was an e-volunteer. We also like to call that an online volunteer, management and systems development advisor for Cuso's SHARE project for the Agency of Civil Societies in 2021 in Addis Ababa, as well as Ethiopia and the Rejoice Africa 2022, also in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. So Menchie, I welcome you to turn on your camera and to unmute yourself and say a quick hello.
Hi, everybody. Good to
Thank
see familiar names and faces. Thank you.
Wonderful. I'm sure the chat is going crazy. I'm not paying too much attention to it, but I'm sure there's lots of comments and recognizing names there. So thank you for joining us, Menchie. We also have with us today, Friedman. Over the past 8 years, Rai has worked in the sector of human rights as it pertains to policy, law, and health. She has a Bachelor's of Arts from the University of Victoria and a Master's in Public Policy and Global Affairs from the University of British Columbia. Her understanding of the rapid and ongoing humanitarian crisis worldwide has been honed through academic, voluntary, and professional experience in Canada, Israel, India, and Greece. Alongside her passion and lifelong dedication to humanitarian and advocacy work, these experiences will enhance her success in contributing to the policy, research, humanitarian, and development sectors to determine innovative solutions. So with that, I welcome Rai to unmute yourself and say a quick hello.
Hi, everyone. So good to see you all.
So with that, just a little bit of housekeeping. I know you're very familiar already with the chat. We are going to have an AMA or a Q&A session. I'm going to leave a little bit more time for that. We're going to be joined by Tania Shephard, our head of programs, Latin America and the Caribbean, and Squier, head of programs for Africa, and Yvette Macabuag, our head of program quality and impact for our international programs. So with that, again, the chat is fine throughout the context of the town hall, but if you really would like the panelists as well as our Cuso staff to engage in the Q&A session afterwards, I ask you to only use the Q&A box for those questions that you'd like us to look at and consider and to respond to. So the Q&A box is your opportunity to ask us questions and engage later on. And we also will have some polls. I know many of you are very familiar with polls, so I won't do one right away. We'll get into that a little bit later. So let's dive right in. I would ask all of the other participants, with the exception of Bianca, to turn off their cameras and to mute themselves. Thank you. So welcome, Bianca. We know that there are many, many forms of volunteering out there, but volunteer for development is quite different. And I think what comes to mind is volunteerism or volunteer tourism. And your PhD, your research is about local volunteering in Burundi. And you co-authored with Dr. Alice Chadwick a research paper entitled Volunteerism and Community Resilience, Locally Owned Solutions Delivering Impact. So I know we don't have all the time in the world. It's only an hour town hall to go through every facet of the research. But if you can please walk us through some highlights, explain what community-based volunteering is, and maybe even share with us how COVID has impacted all of that work to date. And I know you have an opening slide that I'll get to right now. There we go. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Tina, and thank you for the nice introduction, and also to you and the whole team at Cuso that is behind the scenes for setting us up today here in this nice panel across boundaries and many time zones, as we can see in the chat. So as Tina has just mentioned, I'll be discussing today a little bit about resilience, what it means, but also how it relates to volunteering and to the topics of our conversation in this town hall. But before that, I would just like to start us off with this cartoon that you can see here now on the screen, which is part of a provocation for us to think about today. So the cartoon is showing two women who are probably from the same community and who are discussing how the plans of what looks like an international development worker would not be effective, but they look a bit intrigued because this person wouldn't listen to them and would rather keep following his own theory of change. And the women are contesting it from their own lived experience. So please do feel free to share in the chat if you have ever come across a situation like that in your experience. And as we're all in these volunteer spaces, and in particular working with the sustainability in mind to promote sustainable change, I think it's really important that we discuss volunteering and also that we discuss resilience by keeping in mind the perspectives of the communities that we work with, and how important it is that when we are outsiders, we work to support their own priorities rather than the other way around. But I'll come back to that in a moment. So as you can see how in this slide now in the screen, without being too technical or too academic, I would just like to give us a few pointers for our discussion here about resilience. So in simple terms, as you can see there in yellow, we understand resilience as this capacity of individuals and communities to survive, to learn, and to grow stronger from any difficulties that they might face. But resilience has also become a bit of a buzzword, as we know, because we see it all the time, and we see it in reports, in projects, in frameworks, and so on. So it is important for us to keep in mind that the term resilience in itself does not even have a translation in many languages. And this is why we emphasize in this slide here the importance of questioning a little bit what resilience really means. So the first question, resilience of whom? In the definitions, we see resilience that can be interpreted from the perspectives of individuals, households, communities, but we also see in many dominant narratives that we often push for us to think of the poor or the vulnerable as the ones that need to be resilient. So we need to be careful not to understand resilience as a precondition, but rather as something that evolves and in this ability that we all have of learning and growing, as I mentioned before. So the second question in the slide is resilience against what? So current studies and even the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, they often relate resilience to this context of disasters or big shocks that we know that can happen, such as the pandemic that we have all been living through now. But this is very important, of course, but it's also important for us to signal the need to discuss resilience in the face of ongoing threats and these underlying vulnerabilities, such as poverty, lack of education, lack of healthcare, for example. So here we're talking about resilience both against disasters, but also these more kinds of everyday uncertainty, if we can call it like that. So the final question here in the slide, before we move on to discuss community-based volunteering, is resilience against which purpose, for which purpose? So here it's important to reflect about the burden that often comes with the idea of the resilience as placing the responsibility on the individuals and also the communities. So we're very conscious that COVID-19 is changing our reality for good. But as we can see here in the slide, this is why we need to understand resilience as an ongoing process of power shifting, of learning, of adapting to change. And this needs to lead to constant transformation in the directions that are important for all of us to be stronger together, which is actually the topic of our conversation today. So if we move on to my final slide here in this initial thoughts, I would like to bring our discussion to this conversation with community volunteering. So the idea of community volunteering is all about the types of voluntary action that emerge at the community level. So this can happen in many ways, as we all know, sometimes through organizations or in many formal or informal ways, much less formal ways of coming together as friends, as neighbors, for example. So this is something that I've learned myself as a volunteer, but also by doing my PhD research with local volunteers in Burundi, as Tina mentioned earlier. And as you can see here in this photo in the slide. So here you can see some of the local volunteers that I worked with. So the key is to understand community volunteers as the leaders of the development agendas in the locations where they live. So when we talk about international development, we need to be very careful not to exclude any local histories and practices of volunteering, particularly in the Global South, but rather understand all these relationships that can be built and formed through volunteering and the types of horizontal partnerships that can emerge from bringing, for example, international volunteers into these spaces. So I would like to conclude by bringing forward this idea of supportive solidarity that my colleague Alice Shadwick and I have developed in our research about resilience and volunteering. So as you can see here in the slide, at the core of a supportive solidarity model is the importance of listening to community members and to local volunteers to learn what is already happening in the space and what needs to be improved or amplified in line with their own priorities. So if you remember the cartoon in the very first slide, that is probably an example of a lack of supportive solidarity because the international development worker was likely failing to listen and to learn from the community members. And as Tina mentioned, I know this is a topic that is very important for Cuso. So on that note, I would like to hand it over back to you, Tina, for the follow-up of the panel. And thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Bianca. I think, talking about supportive solidarity and community volunteering, I know that Rai and Menchie are going to talk about their experiences and how their practices have enforced some of those. But thank you so much for sharing a little bit of insight onto your research. And we hope that you'll come back and that you continue your research so that we can continue learning from you. Thank you. So with that, I would like to bring you back a little bit later, Bianca. I know we're going to have a bit more of a roundtable where we can share stories and I guess identify some of the issues that you've come across. But right now, I would like to do a quick poll and see how well everybody's been listening. So on your screen, you should see the first poll launched, and it's in both languages, official languages of Canada, English and French. So I'll just give you a little bit more time than usual, but the question is focused on sustainable volunteer models and how they differ from other non-sustainable models. So please take your time and answer that, and I'll share the results momentarily. Okay, so I'll end it in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And I'll share those results. So it's great. 84% of you had all of the above, and that's just some of them. So yes, skilled volunteers like Cuso International volunteers work alongside partners in collaboration. It is a long-term model. So when we talk about sustainability, they're in country from anywhere from 6 months up to 2 years, and they go through extensive training. So I've just mentioned a couple of the pillars of training here, but there is extensive training modules that all of our volunteers go through that I'm sure Rai and Menchie can attest to. So I'm going to stop sharing. Thank you for participating, and we're going to continue along with our programming. So now I would like to bring in Menchie, and I think I have a slide for you as well, Menchie. You're working with the Agency of Civil Societies, and so I'm interested to better understand what they're all about, but also what this, national volunteering guidelines and what the work is that you're doing to be kind of show those diverse volunteer models and to be collaborative and community-based volunteering. So over to you to explain a little bit about the Agency of Civil Societies and the work that you're doing around national volunteering guidelines. So you have the microphone, Menchie.
Thanks, Tina. It's a privilege to be here today. I am an e-volunteer for the SHARE project of Cuso International in Ethiopia. Our partner is AXO. AXO has its new name. ACSO stands for the Authority for Civil Service Organization under the Attorney General's Office of the Federal Democratic Government of Ethiopia. It is the agency that review and approve applications of civil service organizations involving volunteers to support the socioeconomic development plans and actions of the government. Tina, it is important to mention here that Ethiopia has the fastest growing economy among the sub-Saharan countries in the last 10 years, with the highest population, or one of the highest populations, at 117 million. The benefits of the economic growth is yet to be shared with Ethiopians, spread over 1.1 million square kilometers of rugged mountainous terrain that is difficult to traverse. Cuso International's partnership with ACSO in Ethiopia provide volunteers like me exciting opportunities to work alongside local, national, and international organizations in development projects. Projects like Care Canada's Grow Project for Women and Children. It's a health and nutrition project. Midwives Save Lives, which is involved in training local midwives, not just as midwives, but as well as educators. Voice program, Give Voice for Young Girls through university education, You Girls Too, empowering teenage girls to overcome gender barriers through education. And our project, Share Project, which is a capacity building project to develop sustainable development programs in poor and marginalized communities. As an e-volunteer, I was asked to enhance the Volunteerism Management Guideline last year. It is a document well-meaning of promoting volunteerism. We believe will change the picture of development in Ethiopia. We made sure that it is in line of the United Nations Development Sustainable Goal number 17, promoting strong local partnerships. The population being 117 million, our goal was to involve more Ethiopian volunteers from all walks of life. To promote self-reliance, we need to use the vast amount of manpower and capacity for national development to take place much sooner. So just like Bianca, we included volunteerism buzzwords and phrases such as volunteerism is an inclusive partnership, solidarity through collaboration, continuous volunteer support on the ground. Volunteers also has a responsibility to protect. And my favorite one is volunteer recognition enhances volunteer commitment. There are two important messages our partner and I made sure we deliver in this guideline. Number one, local volunteerism must be synonymous to nationalism. Local volunteerism has the ability to drive the direction of national development to achieve peace. We know that the seeds of nationalism, watered right at the grassroots level by dedicated local volunteers, have significant multiple outcomes and long-term impact. The second message is that we have to sell volunteering as a business investment involving everyone. Reason being, we know that vested men and women, young and old, who freely give their time and talent volunteering will work, and they will work hard to do everything to protect their investments. They will maintain peace because of their dream of leaving poverty behind. And they have an urgent need to move towards their one and only dream, and that is to give their children much better future than theirs. with the National Volunteerism Management Guideline completed, we moved on to develop the Facilitators Training Manual for Volunteer Coordinators, the Volunteer Handbook, and the Facilitators PowerPoint presentation. And I would say the project is an affirmation of my volunteer training in Cuso and much more. It is a narrative of my personal journey as a volunteer and the journey of many men and women, along with I worked in Ethiopia. The guideline includes best practices from around the world, including countries, specifically including countries in Africa. It includes multiple thoughts and feedback from people on the ground, plus the valuable experiences and lessons learned by myself, my former co-volunteers, and the suggestions of former colleagues from our partner organizations.
Thank you, Menchie. It was very moving. There was a pause there, and I think it just, reinforced the impact that it's had on you. So thank you for going through some of the programming that Cuso has had over the years as well. And now with that, I would like to kind of culminate this discussion with a video that represents, solidarity and volunteer for development. Talking about driving impact. Odette Kamanzi is a resident of Quebec City. She's originally from Rwanda, and she was the first Canadian volunteer leaving on placement after this craziness of a 20-month embargo on travel due to COVID-19. She is currently in Cameroon working alongside our local organization, Women in Alternative Action, WAA, and she is working in the role of gender advisor. So this is a native French language, is her, the community as well as her. The video, what I'm trying to say, is in French, but it has English subtitles. So you should be able to follow along nicely. So just momentarily, I'll show this.
Une excellente initiative que je porte particulière car c'est une approche des changements par le père. Il suffit de donner les outils nécessaires aux reines et mères pour régler les mariages d'enfants. Surtout à ce moment de crise qui dure déjà 2 ans. Il y a beaucoup de nombre de filles qui sont données en mariage. Alors c'est un bon moment pour réagir parce que c'est aussi la transition de jeunes filles pour l'adolescence. Le point fort, c'est cette transformation qu'on fait sur chaque personne et sur le groupe de personnes. Il faut agir maintenant. Nous comptons faire une formation avec une boîte à outils visuels, thématiques faciles à utiliser pour la sensibilisation. Nous allons former aussi les femmes par leur usage et ensuite nous allons mettre sur pied un mécanisme de suivi et évaluation qui nous aidera à voir l'impact et les changements sur les hommes, les femmes et les jeunes filles d'ici 1 ou 2 ans.
So with that, I've stopped the presentation. Now we're kind of just going to be speaking to you. I would like to introduce Friedman, who has also been working alongside the Agency of Civil Societies and producing national volunteer guidelines. So you've heard Bianca talk about community-driven, the approach to development, and your colleague Menchie speak about the work. I don't know if there's anything, and I welcome if there's something you'd like to add to that in that respect, but I'm also kind of curious as to your personal journey in becoming a volunteer, like what's motivated you, and also around the collaboration and partnerships, like what has been the impact of the project and what does it aim to do? So you have the microphone.
Thank you so much, Tina, for giving me the opportunity. And thank you so much for the generous introduction and to all our amazing speakers and organizers for this event. Bianca and Menchie, I think you did an incredible job. So thank you so much. I've been reading through some of the comments as this has happened, and I've seen that we have a large international community with us, as well as a national community with us. And I join that sentiment in being international. I join you from Sri Lanka at the moment, but I grew up in Vancouver. So I would like to acknowledge the territory there, which is the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. So I just appreciate benefiting from that so much. I chose to become a volunteer with Cuso International because of the intrinsic work that they do in their host communities. Cuso ensures the well-being of those they serve above all else. Cuso has been a leader in the industry for over 60 years and continues to diversify their projects, especially as time goes on. I've been a volunteer with Cuso since April 2021, and I'm really proud to be part of this organization that enables tangible outputs. The work I've done in Cuso thus far has been to write a volunteerism policy in Ethiopia. Not only has this accredited me useful skills, but it has also shown me the importance of collaboration. When COVID restrictions lift, I sincerely look forward to joining my team members and partners in Ethiopia.
Thank you for that, Rai. We hope that, these COVID restrictions lift as well and you're able to travel soon. So with those personal reflections, I think what we'll do is I'll ask Bianca to turn on her camera and Menchie to turn on your camera as well. And maybe we can get into some tangible examples or stories. And we'll start with Bianca, if you can kind of share an example or a story. And, you might want to go back to some of the first slides that you spoke to around best practices of community-based volunteering in action. And then the thought for Menchie and Rai is perhaps you can talk about the different kinds of sustainable volunteering that's out there that you've worked on. I know you talked about eVolunteer. Menchie, you spoke about the GROW program, and I do have some slides for you, Menchie, if you want me to pull those up, but maybe we can do the roundtable and start off with Bianca on best practices for community-based volunteering.
Thank you very much, Tina, and thank you, Ryan and Menchie, as well, for all the reflections and for sharing your experiences. I think this resonates with many of the participants here in this conversation today, and it's really nice to make it personal because volunteering is all about people, isn't it? It's about how we build the relationships, how we connect. And when you're asking about best practices, Tina, maybe I would go back to the idea that I shared earlier about the supportive solidarity model to share an experience from Burundi that I learned about when I was doing my PhD research with local volunteers there. And this is all about the sustainable ways of generating income through volunteering. So basically, the supportive solidarity experience that I could see there was in the sense that the picture that you saw a little bit earlier in the slide, that was a group of women volunteers from the community, and they were producing flour that they could sell and revert the gains to the benefit of the community in terms of how they could support each other and identify those that were in need of a specific kinds of in-kind or financial support. But as soon as they identified that as an activity that they could develop, through the networks and through the partnerships that the Burundi Red Cross could build nationally and internationally, they were able to partner with other organizations to be able to afford and to provide the kinds of equipment and materials that they needed to continue on their journey of the local community volunteering activities, but in this sense of being supported in their own needs and priorities. So that meant that the model became sustainable and that the volunteers would still be able to connect with each other, but also build these network that was also supported by an external partner that was rather listening and learning from the needs that the community volunteers had identified. So maybe I could leave that as an initial example. And if we come back to the discussion, maybe we can explore other aspects as well. But I would love to hear from Menchie and Rai too.
Sure. Menchie, did you want me to pull up the slide of the GROW group that you were with?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Thanks, Tina.
You're welcome.
As a volunteer on the ground, with the GROW project, one of the few things we made sure is that we included everybody. We invited onlookers, fence sitters, men and women sitting at the corner store who loves to know anything and everything that's going on in the community. We spent time having small talks. Their remarkable influence and communication skills, together with our 2 cents, were worth a fortune in facilitating communication, building trust and interest in our development program. And another thing is that volunteering is a collaborative work. Development is a collaborative work. We have to involve the volunteer. We have to involve the beneficiaries of the program and the stakeholders in the program. We have to involve the beneficiaries because it is their life we are touching. To a certain extent, we are tweaking their life. It is important that they play an active role in planning, implementing, monitoring, and measuring the success of the program, because it will build strength of the program. One of the exciting things that took place was that in the process of education and transferring the technology, the stakeholders, the government office officials, and the beneficiaries themselves scaled up the project by sharing what they had learned to their friends and even moving it towards the next town.
Thank you, Menchie. That's fantastic. And so with some of those reflections, I'd like to invite Rai to the conversation. And again, the question is around sustainable volunteering models. Like, is there anything that you can share in that respect?
Yeah, just to kind of piggyback off of what Menchie was just saying, volunteerism is an integral part of society. It promotes social, economic, and political benefits, as well as many, many more unforeseen. Individuals acquire new professional and social competencies. They can build bonds and social capital in local communities. It also presents investment opportunities in resources. It boosts team morale, increases productivity, improves staff participation and well-being, and progresses overall achievement goals. Ultimately, it includes people, as Menchie was saying, from a diverse set of life, whether they are onlookers or people who are deeply involved in the community. It doesn't have barriers the same way that maybe employment or social clubs do. And it just, honestly, it benefits everybody as a whole collectively. So it is a very, very important part of society.
Thank you for sharing that. And so I know I'm going to bring you all back for some closing reflections. But before I do that, I don't know if there's something within this context you still want to add, or if we can move on with our programming. We'll move on. Okay. So before we get to the Q&A, I see we've got lots of we have lots of questions. Sorry, I had to look down at the Q&A box. I just want to share another poll with you and reiterate that this past Saturday in Canada, we wrapped up International Development Week 2022. And for those of you who are unfamiliar, it shines a spotlight on the important contributions that Canadians are making through partnerships around the world. And this year's theme, as we've all been talking about throughout this town hall so far, is Go for the Goals. So within the Sustainable Development Goals. And I thought I would test your knowledge, and Menchie said the answer already within her scope, but I thought I'd test your knowledge on knowing just a little bit, even just the number of SDGs, sustainable goals that there are. So let me launch this second poll. Again, it's in English and French. And how many goals are there in total? Some of you were listening. That's great. It was just a little fun poll. So I'm going to share the results with you right now. There are 17 goals and they're all integrated. So although they're, quadrant out into 17 different boxes, you can't do one without the other. And Cuso really focuses on number one, which is ending poverty and inequality around the world. And then our government of Canada has the Feminist International Assistance Policy. So there's a high focus on SDG number 5, which is around gender equality. And so if you'd like to know more, I invite you to learn about the goals and see how that integrates within the volunteer sector. I'm going to stop sharing now and continue on. With that, I'm leaving a little bit more time than usual for our Ask Me Anything session. And I'm not going to put up the slide. I had a nice slide that said Ask Me Anything, but I think the whole point is that we all come together. And so with that, I would like to invite Tania Shephard, our head of programs for Latin America and the Caribbean, and Squier, head of programs for Africa, and Yvette Macabuag, our head of programs for quality and impact international programs, to join the discussion. So please turn on your cameras and your microphones, and we're going to have a nice roundtable of discussion and fodder around this important topic. So we did get a couple of questions in advance, and I'd like to start with those. I'm going to try and do 2 at a time, and if we can get through all 13 questions, that'll be fantastic. But for Yvette, the question was, SHARE is the biggest project for volunteer recruitment. How many positions do you recruit annually? And what are the types of roles that are required? So I know Menchie mentioned a little bit about SHARE, but Yvette, if you want to talk a little bit about SHARE and then go into the recruitment, the positions and the roles that are required, I'd appreciate that. And then for Tania or Anna, I don't know who wants to answer this one, but it's around policy development. And they're asking, are volunteers involved in policy development, such as gender equality, social inclusion, or climate? So we'll start off with Yvette. Welcome. Welcome to the Ask Me Anything.
Thanks, Tina, and good afternoon, good evening, good morning to everyone who's joining us on the call today. Thanks for the question. So as you've mentioned, SHARE is the name of our project that we're delivering under Global Affairs Canada's Volunteer Cooperation Program. We are delivering the project in 10 countries in 2 regions in Africa, as well as Latin America and the Caribbean. And the focus is on addressing gender inequality and aiming for more inclusive programming and services from the partners that we're working with in those countries. Primarily, we are delivering the project through our volunteers. So in total, over the course of the 7-year project, we aim to deliver 1,000 volunteers, complemented by 100 e-volunteers, working with our partners to address capacity building needs in various areas, everywhere from strengthening management practices, delivery of programs, communications, IT, gender equality, so putting in place policies and practices that help strengthen the work that they're doing to be more inclusive and address barriers for women and girls. On average, we aim for about 100 and 120 volunteers to be deployed annually. In some years, that could be as high as 200. So of course, we've been impacted by the pandemic. So we are stabilizing and recruiting around 150 volunteers at the moment, and that's our aim for this year. The roles vary, quite a large number looking for volunteers with skills in business and management, so supporting small business development, training, development of different supports, access to finance. We have quite a number of roles that focus on gender. So developing policies, procedures that promote inclusive engagement of women and girls. We also have quite a number of roles that are focused on communications. So anything from website development, supporting communications campaign, recruitment, marketing, outreach, advocacy, social media, those kinds of roles. So as you can see, it's quite varied. There are the more technical roles, supporting in the area of agriculture, environment, monitoring and evaluation as well. So it really runs the gamut, and it depends on what the needs of our partners are and the areas that they're looking for support in terms of strengthening.
Thank you, Yvette. Over to Tania or Anna, and I'm not sure who wants to go. I'll just see who gets to the microphone first.
Sure,
Sure, I can start. Thank you so much, Yvette, and all of our panelists. I must say that one of the most exciting things about my job is I get to see the impact of the work of volunteers on the ground. So I can share with you 3 specific examples of the impact that our volunteers have had on developing public policies in different areas. I think one of the most exciting things I witnessed in Guyana is we had been working with one of the local ministries, and we had an amazing volunteer that drafted the first ever national gender and social inclusion policy for Guyana. That was instrumental, monumental. And I remember I had the pleasure of meeting the ministry and meeting the volunteers, but I was just so proud of the work that the volunteer championed within the ministry, learning what is gender equality, what is social inclusion, how do we, talk to people to get their feedback. So that was really exciting. Building on our work in the Caribbean, I'm excited to announce that we are in the process of signing a contribution agreement for a new project that will have a strong volunteer component, whereby we will send Canadian volunteers who are gender equality and social inclusion experts to work with 4 local governments in the Caribbean. And it's all about how do we better integrate gender equality and social inclusion to ensure we're meeting the needs and interests of the most vulnerable populations, which include women and youth, the LGBTI community, and of course, persons living with disabilities. So that's also very exciting for us. We've translated from what we've done under Voice and our great work under Share, and we've now translated into a new gender project in the Caribbean. So that's very exciting. And just lastly, I will share an example from Colombia. We do a lot of work with our Afro-Colombian population, mainly Afro-Colombian women. And we had been working with a local municipality in Guapi, which is near, I believe, the Caribbean coast of Colombia. And we had a volunteer that worked alongside of the local municipality, as well as a local women's organization, to ensure that gender equality and social inclusion is better reflected in local policies and programs. And it was so exciting because it was the first time that this had been done. We're now in the process of working with the volunteer, the women's organization, and the local municipality to see if we can replicate that process in other local municipalities. So those are just 3 quick examples of the great work that volunteers are doing in policy development across Latin America and the Caribbean. I'm going to pass it over to Anna, who's going to share a few examples from Africa.
Hi, everyone. It's really nice to be here today. I just have 2 examples, and building on what Tania just mentioned, we do a lot of outward work with our policy development, but we also do a lot of inward work with our policy development. And we work specifically with our partners themselves to build their capacity to be able to be more responsive to some of these important issues that we're dealing with in the world. How are we more responsive to gender? How are we ensuring that we're more inclusive when we are working as a local organization? How are we ensuring that we're taking into account marginalized groups, disabled groups, women, youth, LGBTQ increasingly as well? And I think that this is really an important aspect as we're moving forward as volunteers and volunteer organizations, that we are really looking at what's the capacity that we're doing internally and operationally within the volunteers, within our partner organizations themselves. I think another really interesting piece of work that we're starting to explore, and we're looking at partnerships and developing the partnerships, is that both in Tanzania and in Ethiopia, we're increasingly looking at national volunteer policies and how can Cuso contribute to the development of national volunteer policies, because this is something, especially on this continent, gross generalization perhaps, but is increasingly important, and people being able to give back to their communities is increasingly interesting and accessible. And so how do we support volunteers who want to come forward and give back to do that? So I'll pass that back over to Tina, excuse me.
That's okay.
For the next question, thanks.
Thank you. So I'm just seeing a whole lot of questions around recruitment. How do I get involved? So first off, thank you for wanting to be part of the Cuso community and volunteer. There is quite an extensive amount of information on our website at www.cusointernational.org. You can sign up for newsletters to be the first in line. There's all kinds of materials there. And last but not least, if you're not finding what you're looking for, please do get in touch with us, and we'll make sure that that information gets passed down to you. I'm not ignoring all the recruitment recruitment questions, but we'll be here for quite some time if I start answering recruitment. I think there's an interesting question for Menchie. So they thank you for your presentation, Menchie. What do you want to tell those in the diaspora, so Ethiopian diaspora, who want to volunteer in Ethiopia in the future? How can organizations, and I guess a second part to that question is, how can organizations in Ethiopia access the volunteer guidelines? So maybe Menchie, you can take the first question, and Rai, you can take the second question of that, if possible. It's just around access to the guidelines that you've been working on. So over to you, Menchie, for getting involved in the future.
I think it should be reverse, actually, and
Sure.
with the guidelines, because the first question had to do more with policy, which is what I focused on, and the second question had to do more with how, what was the part of the second question? It was how organizations could get involved.
So how do they access the guidelines that you've created? How
Right.
do organizations in Ethiopia? Is it through the government? Is it through the organization itself? But let's go to the first question for Menchie, and it's around what would you say to diaspora who want to get involved in Ethiopia in the future? What would be your advice, Menchie, or Rai? Advice to those wanting to get involved in Ethiopia in the future, particularly the diaspora community. Any advice? Any suggestions?
Menchie, you're on mute. You're on mute.
Oh,
still.
she's been speaking.
I am terribly sorry. I would say you already have access to Cuso International. Use the website and you would be able to get in and apply, and Cuso will connect you with the local organizations with whom you could connect.
Yeah, there's a whole volunteer journey that's that we follow. So yeah, we welcome that. And I think from your comments earlier on, you were just very impactful and touched by your experience as a volunteer. So sounds like you'd recommend it.
Highly, highly.
And Rai, sorry, I was confused. What did you want to answer just around the organizations?
Oh, the policy. Yeah, if they were speaking about organizations that are within Ethiopia, for instance, and how to implement the policy that's being written for ACSO, that's what's currently in the works now. That was part of my role, was to write a national volunteerism policy, because as we talked about, there's no unified definition of what it means to be a volunteer. So not only does that mean that there's varied ways of being a volunteer, but it also doesn't provide rights for certain volunteers. Like they could be misused, or they could be overworked and underpaid, or not compensated, or whichever. So for organizations to get that policy, that's kind of what's happening now, is that the government kind of votes on that, and then that just gets disseminated the same way that it would in Canada, or not the same, but it's kind of the same sentiment, right? Like if it's a national policy, organizations have to look to that. So yeah, I just wanted to speak to the policy part.
Perfect. No, I appreciate that. So I see a lot of raised hands. If you can put it in the Q&A, that would be very helpful for us to be able to consolidate all of the questions. There's a question, I think it might be for Yvette, but it could be Anna or Tandy as well. It's focused, like we don't work in post-conflict countries, but it's more around risk management of volunteers. Like, I don't know if somebody wants to talk to any of the solutions around risk management when we're sending volunteers to country. And so they're asking about post-conflict. I can tell you right now, we're not in those countries, but we still have risk management processes and procedures in place. I don't know if anybody wanted to elaborate on that a little bit.
Sure. And then invite Tandy and Anna to add. So Cuso, it's a great question. Cuso does have a very robust system in place that ensures our duty of care. So what that means is we want to minimize any potential risks to our volunteers, to our partners, to our staff, in any of the activities that we undertake. So we've got some policies, we've got procedures, and we've got some systems that allow us to assess any potential risks, and then to identify tools that will help us to manage or to mitigate those risks. We recognize that we can't completely prevent them, but we can do what we can to ensure that we understand the context that we're working in and putting in measures that will help to keep everyone involved with our programming safe.
Thank you. I see some hands up, so go ahead.
Yeah, I can just complement that. We actually are working in countries that are in post-conflict states. They may be in a little bit farther. So for example, Colombia is a country that we have worked in since 2015, where they first were starting looking at, the agreements and the signing of the agreements. I think the strategy that we've used in Colombia is a lot of our volunteers are Colombian Canadian diaspora. So they understand very well the security context. We're able to put them perhaps in cities or regions where maybe we wouldn't be able to have somebody who didn't understand the severity of the situation or what was going on. So I think we have experience. I think also in countries where we perhaps maybe can't place volunteers, we do work through local partners. We can also have a volunteer placed in Bogota, for example. They can't travel to Buenaventura, but they can go back and forth, or we can work through partners. So we have been looking sort of creative ideas of how we can still have impact in countries where there may be a post-conflict scenario, but what's safe for the volunteer and safe for our partners as well.
Thank you, Tandy. Magoté, je vois que vous avez une question en français. Je vais vous répondre, mais je vais vous répondre par courriel. I'm just letting Magoté speaking had a question in French around Senegal, and I'm just letting them know that I'll be responding via email to that, as I'm just also looking at the time. There's lots and lots of questions around recruitment and the process of volunteering. Thank you for that. Thank you for the high fives as well, as far as enjoying the town hall. I do want to leave some closing remarks for our panelists. So thank you. I know there's still 24 questions in the queue. Many of them are recruitment, so we'll get back to you very quickly on those. That won't take any time at all. We are going to answer every question, so not to worry. I'd like to, at this time, thank Bianca Fadel, Friedman, and Menchie Alcantara, as well as my colleagues from Cuso International, for sharing your insights, and particularly this model of development that really supports communities to shape their own development agendas. And with that, I would like to offer any final words to Menchie, and Bianca. I don't know if there's something you want to leave with our Canadian public around your work, Cuso's work, or volunteerism in general, but maybe we can start with then go to Menchie, and then we'll close out with Bianca. Go ahead, Rai.
Thank you so much. So sorry, before I skipped forward just a little bit, but I just want to talk a little bit more about the volunteerism policy. So volunteerism, as we talked about, has brought forward so many benefits to the community, and it just embodies so many positive practices. But the situation in Ethiopia is characterized by volunteering in the forms of youth, retired professionals, women, men, active professionals, and persons with disabilities, among others. Voluntary activity can take place across all sectors of Ethiopian society with a specific focus on social well-being. Currently, there is no single coordinated definition of volunteering. This has led institutions and organizations to develop independent tools, such as volunteer management approaches, practices, guidelines, and policies, which has further exacerbated coordination efforts. Since there is no singular or binding definition of volunteerism, the term has the potential for misuse. For instance, in certain circumstances, volunteerism may be considered as a social or religious obligation. In said circumstances, there is a degree of compulsion that can be applied, and these practices do not qualify as volunteering. That is why it is so important to have things like the Cuso program, where a volunteer policy can be written or be assisted in being written. And that's just why it's also important to have a unified definition. So thank you all so much for having me today and having me as a guest speaker. And I just look forward to meeting you all very soon.
Thank you, Rai. Menchie, over to you. Any closing thoughts?
I'd like to thank the people, the volunteers that was with me, or that were with me in developing the volunteerism guideline for Ethiopia and AXO in particular, one of whom is Friedman, who worked on the policy, Angel Brown on the best practices, and Fernando Cerda, who worked on M&E, monitoring and evaluation. Their tremendous work helped me really deliver the product AXO. And considering what we have done, whatever we did becomes the property of Cuso and AXO. So I would suggest to that one person who wanted to have access to the guideline, ask Cuso about it. And there's also other guidelines from various countries. They have developed theirs. One best practice, if I may share further, Tina. One personal
30
best
seconds.
Okay, one best practice, don't forget to bring your toothbrush and your toothpaste just in case you can't go home and you have to stay overnight. Be practical. It's okay to go to the community on an empty stomach. Just make sure you bring with you an empty Ziploc. So just in case they feed you, you secure your next meal. One last thing, understand and remember the goals of CUSA and your partners, because this is going to be your lifestyle and it will be your message on the ground.
Thank you, Menchie. And Bianca, closing thoughts?
Thank you so much, Tina, and thanks all for the nice discussion today. I think as a concluding thought, I would quickly say that we do need to center our conversations about development in the community development aspect, which goes beyond the international development, isn't it? Because development is what we do in so many ways, where we live and where we work. So I think my final message is really about us all understanding these many different forms of engaging voluntarily and supporting others. And this can happen wherever we are, and understanding that every little aspect of this experience, every little action actually means a lot. So thank you all for listening and for organizing this nice event.
Thank you. And with that, we are closing out. Thank you for helping me unpack Volunteer for Development. If we are all to, as Bianca said, have community members lead and have diverse volunteer methods available to shape sustainable development, we really need to keep this ever-evolving conversation going. And in closing, I hope that you really do understand Cuso International a little bit better, our programming, and how we really benefit community members. So you will be receiving a short survey. We always appreciate your feedback. You'll also be receiving a recording of this town hall. We welcome you to share it with your colleagues and friends. And with that, thank you. Cuso is committed to working alongside community members to create a fair, sustainable, and safer world. And we really can't do this without you. We invite you to support our work and make a donation today. Cuso International also gratefully acknowledges the financial support of the Government of Canada through Global Affairs Canada, as well as our donors and our supporters. And with that, thank you for your service. Thank you for supporting Cuso International. In solidarity, bye for now. Thank you, everybody.